Okay, so let me introduce you now to the two people that are going to be providing some reflections, short. We asked them to reflect on the talks for like 5 minutes or so, and then open it up for discussion. The first one is Bruce Ferguson. Bruce is a professor in the agroecology group at the Colegio de la Frontera Sur in Chiapas, Mexico, where he is also the coordinator of the Agriculture, Society, and Environment Department. He got his master's degree from here and his PhD from here. And I didn't mention, where everybody got their degrees, but I thought that, since Bruce got it here, we should mention that. He's also from Michigan, from Kalamazoo. And he has conducted extensive research field work in Nicaragua, Guatemala, and Mexico on forest regeneration in agricultural landscapes. His current work emphasizes agroecological education, urban agroecology, participatory agroecological certification, and more generally scaling up agroecology for a more just and sustainable food system. Cami Pothukuchi, she is Associate Professor of Urban Planning at Wayne State University and the founding director of Seed Wayne, a campus-wide or a campus community collaboration to build sustainable food systems in Detroit. Her research examines the links between food and community and economic development and the roles public and nonprofit agencies might play to foster these links. Cami co-authored the Community and Regional Food Planning Policy Guide, which was adopted by the American Planning Association in 2007. And Cami also serves on the Detroit Food Policy Council and the Detroit Food and Fitness Collaborative. So let's start with Bruce, and then Cami will come after Bruce, and then we will open up for discussion.
May I also say I got my master's and my PhD from University of Michigan.
Oh, I forgot to mention that as well. Yeah. So I also want to remind you that after we finish here, there's going to be food and drinks in the commons. So please stay on and stay for having more informal conversations. Can people hear? I'm not sure how are we doing with the sound.
Well, I want to thank the organizers. It's really a pleasure to be here in Ann Arbor, see so many friends, and also to put some faces with some very familiar names. So as an agroecologist, it's humbling to try to comment on such a distinguished panel of social scientists, but I hope that I can come at some of these same issues and questions from a slightly different angle and contribute to the debate in that way. So I think that agroecology as a science is really at a frontier, scientifically speaking, on many questions, things like the diversity and function of microbiota in the soil, on plants, in leaves, and so forth. The cycling, the movement of nutrients at many different scales in soil and water. There are many things like this that we still don't understand very well. The autonomous regulation of potential pests, for example, at landscape scale and at a farm scale, which the kind of work that Yvette and John have been doing at the Finkerland in Chiapas that has generated so much interesting work along with their graduate students. So there's a lot to do in ecological terms in agroecology to understand how these systems work and to build from local and traditional knowledge to try and be able to generalize more broadly about how agroecosystems work. But at the same time that there's a lot that we don't know about agroecology, there's a lot that we do know, and a lot of this comes from directly or indirectly from traditional and local agroecological knowledge. And so while many of the researchers in our group have been focused on traditional knowledge and on these kinds of ecological aspects of agroecology, it kind of begs the questions for us, as one of the largest and oldest agroecology groups in the world, why, although San Cristobal in particular and Chiapas as well are sort of crucibles of agroecology and food sovereignty, as I like the way that someone over here put it earlier. Why there isn't more going on? Why is it that the broader population hasn't benefited more deeply from agroecology and a more broader adoption of agroecological methods? And in fact, sometimes it seems like we're losing ground to the other side. So recently then, with Hilda and with Peter Rossett, we've started a group at Ecosur that's looking at how to scale up agroecology, obviously with the intention of contributing to a food sovereignty. And so as Annette says, as academics, we've arrived a little bit late to the food sovereignty movement, but we're getting, well, not Peter, obviously, but as a department, we're getting there. And I think that part of the challenge to scaling up is complexity. So agroecology is a science that embraces diversity and complexity, just as food sovereignty is a movement that embraces diversity as complexity, and complexity as Annette and Hannah pointed out. And this is the strength of the food sovereignty movement, but it's also what makes it difficult to interpret, to understand, to generalize, to build theory on. And so complexity can be an impediment to delivering clear and compelling messages to the public about agroecology. What is agroecology? What is food sovereignty? They're not easy to define in an elevator speech unless maybe you're Dick Levins. It also, that's one of the challenges to scaling up agroecology, and how to do that without losing its transformative potential is definitely a concern that we share with Hannah. Another challenge is, excuse me, obviously the hostile neoliberal political and trade regimes that Phil and Annette talked about mostly. And in our scaling up group, then we've started by looking at some local examples from Mexico, from Brazil, from India and Cuba. We're emphasizing the roles of organizational structures, of formal and informal education and knowledge generation, of political strategy and policy, of markets, as well as agroecological practice itself. So the first set of questions that I want to ask the panel is about this question of scaling up agroecology, and whether you have identified strategies that are effective or perhaps ineffective to help foster local food sovereignty initiatives, and how to scale them up without losing their richness and complexity. This same question I think that you were posing for us, and how academics can play an effective role in these processes. And one strategy that we've identified and that was mentioned last night at the panel in Detroit is building on existing social structures and movements. So in both Chiapas and in India, for example, agroecology movements are building on religious movements, for example. So there's a movement called Zero Budget Natural Farming in India that's very tied up with Hindu spirituality, and that uses Hindu temples for meetings. In Chiapas, there are groups called Pastorales contra los agrotóxicos, so religious-based communities that work against agrotoxics and now against GMOs as well. And Held and I are working on using formal educational structures as pre-existing structures that broadly and deeply penetrate the geography of the state, for example. And we've found that the teachers that we work with in our school gardens programs are very sympathetic, for the most part, to the anti-hegemonic message that agroecology and food sovereignty bring to the table. So we see potential there to co-opt the system from below to a certain extent. And I'm wondering if you see this as a kind of a strategy that makes sense, and if you can identify other similar areas of opportunity. Thanks.
Thank you all. I want to thank Yvette especially and Leslie for inviting me to this event. Bruce mentioned how daunting it is to comment on the presentations of the luminaries behind me, but I should also add that it's daunting to be presenting in a forum with my teachers in the audience. So I'm glad that I'm just a discussant and not actually presenting a large lecture for them to write critical comments on. I can't promise that my entire set of remarks will be coherent, but I'll make an attempt. I'm going to speak from a very sort of hyper-local perspective, recognizing, of course, the admonition that the local is connected to other levels. And I'm also speaking wearing a plannerly hat. Planners believe in collective action, collective responses to our collective problems, but also as someone who's fairly steeped in community food work, trying to bring planning perspectives and approaches to the work. And here I want to give a shout out to my fellow travelers in Detroit food system work, Catherine Underwood, who has done amazing work in leading urban agriculture policy, among other things, for the city of Detroit. I want to recognize Shane Bernardo, who's a food justice activist with the Earthworks Urban Farm, Erica Jorda, who's worked in Detroit as well. So I'm going to highlight two questions that were raised, and then I'll see if I can, if I'll be permitted to give you a little bit of context to place those questions sort of on the ground in the work that we do in Detroit. The first question is that Hannah raised is the challenge of the challenge of earning sustainable livelihoods while also delivering all of these values, access to healthy food, all the values that are embedded in agroecology and sustainability and democracy and so on. So I want to highlight that one question. I'd like our speakers to elaborate on that, and maybe also I'd like to hear more from you all about what you think about responses to that question. And then the second question that I'd like to highlight is how to connect the struggles of the struggles and the issues of different groups, issues when it comes to racism and ethnocentrism and prejudice, racial prejudice, issues of local, regional, and other levels, and other issues, and challenges and struggles. How do you connect them? So I did number my pages, and I think I am very interested as a planner who has a perspective on the role of government as a positive force about the question of institutionalization, especially when you talk about institutionalization through policy and regulations and public funding and so on. And of course, I'm also an academic, so I'm very interested in the role of the academic planner, where a field of practice, not only in terms of research, but also in terms of shifting discourse. For example, so now I'm going to my context of the work in Detroit. I lead a program called Seed Wayne, which is a campus community collaborative to build sustainable food systems on Wayne State's campus and in Detroit, very lofty goals. And those of you who will be going to Detroit on Saturday will see the very vibrant set of relationships and vibrant, energetic scene in terms of food sovereignty being enacted at the local level. I think it's fair to say that urban agriculture, especially in Detroit, came about as a response to the abandonment of market actors from the city, and also the abandonment of the city by these large-scale economic actors, but also the apathy and in some cases inadequate responses by local government to solve the problems that were being experienced in the neighborhoods. So as urban agriculture grew, we see all these values being essentially performed. There was a lot of collaboration and sharing of resources. Oh, I will wrap up. And cooperative solutions with people holding multiple values, and also trying to educate people about racism in the food system and engaging each other in dialogues about anti-racism, making national and international connections, and also the development of government policy to support these practices. But the question is, how do you do justice? How do you do justice work at the grassroots level? While all those things that I described are still in place and in practice, there are also tensions and contradictions that are emerging. How do people who are working on the east side of Detroit, who are themselves low income, earn money? There are all these programs related to agricultural entrepreneurship. And the question is, how can you become an entrepreneur while also trying to deliver affordable food in a neighborhood that's as poor as you are? And so there are dynamics of competition where there previously was collaboration. There's competition and collaboration at the same time. There are now there's the funders. There's competition for funding. Bigger nonprofits tend to be able to attract more funding and are more powerful in this scheme. So these there's now much more of a primacy given to economic arguments. So the question is, while given all this energy and vibrancy, there are also challenges in terms of small pots of funding. There's, where is funding coming from? Small federal pots, small foundation pots. There's some legislation, but there's also contradictory dynamics in terms of preemption and other kinds of forces. So I'll leave it there. I just want to, again, go back to the questions that motivated some of my comments. If I was given 2 more minutes, I will talk about the experiences of our farmers market in light of these challenges, but I'm going to wrap up and just reiterate those questions that I initially started with. And those are, how do you earn a livelihood while still holding and delivering all of the values of food sovereignty? And how do you connect these various struggles that we're experiencing and acting, struggles that we're, what is the verb for engaging in at the grassroots level? Thank you.
Okay, well, this question of how do you make a living? How do you ensure people's livelihoods? I think that is absolute, and it's such a central question. I mean, how exactly, in what concrete ways does food sovereignty, which includes agroecology, how does food sovereignty actually improve the well-being of people? And I want to use well-being because I think we need to even go beyond just livelihoods. And I'm just thinking, very quickly of some of the interviews I did in Spain with some of the farmers in the Basque Country who are deindustrializing their agricultural system because it isn't working for them. And, one farmer said I asked him, well, so, what are the benefits? And he goes, I can sleep at night. I thought, wow, that's not a question that would come up on some normal interview on, measuring your improvement in livelihood, so I think, but I think it's a central question. We need much more research that actually measures the difference that shift
in system can make. And we also need, I think, research that actually looks very carefully at the human rights violations and abuses when there's a conflict between those two models, the food sovereignty model and the industrial model. I'll stop there.
I'd love to stand up. So I have in the work that I've done with farmers in North America and in Latin America, this question it always comes up. And one of the things that,
People here in the back?
yeah, one of the things that I've learned is, you want me to use it? Okay. Challenged by technology today. So one of the things that I've seen is it's actually a two-way street between the ability of a farm family or an indigenous family to self-provision and their ability to engage with the world around them to support that in the broader societal needs. So basically, consumers have to be able and willing to pay the true cost of food. That means that consumers actually need a living wage in their livelihood. So it's not just about the livelihood of the farmer, it's about the livelihood of the community. So that's the first thing I would say to that question. We can't assume that farmers are different than anyone else, that they should have to sacrifice more or subsidize anyone else. Another piece of that puzzle is right now, many sustainable farmers, agroecological farmers, are in fact subsidizing the cost of food with their labor, with their unpaid labor. If the conventionally produced or the industrial food system started paying the true cost of that model of production, if they paid the ecological costs, if they paid a living wage to farm workers, if they paid the health costs of people who are suffering from pesticide exposure, then that food would actually become more expensive, and maybe the kind of food that is produced agroecologically would then become more affordable for consumers as well. So I guess thinking about livelihoods in the social context and understanding that food is both a human right, but it's also something that has to be created through the intersection of labor with land. I think it makes it a different kind of product than something else that would be manufactured differently. So that's the piece for the livelihoods. And then I just wanted to make a comment on the scaling up piece, because that's one that we also really struggle with. If you scale up a production practice, does it become industrial? And I see a real fear of that in a lot of local food movements. They think, well, if we get bigger, we're going to lose our identity, or if we get bigger, we're going to start exploiting somebody. And so that's a real tension, I think. We often think maybe of scaling out. So rather than getting bigger, it's extending into new areas or extending relationships. You can scale, you can go deeper, you can do more of something using more people. So I think just to push back a little bit against this concept of scaling up as getting bigger, but actually having it extending through the food system more deeply rather than specializing more and more, which is often how scaling up is utilized.
Well, thanks for the questions you guys put to us. I'm not doing the kind of research that Annette and Hannah are doing, but picking up on what Hannah was talking about, one of the things that I think is really important is to talk about shifting subsidies away from the agribusiness and the energy sector to the agrarian sector to start with. I really like the way in which Hannah just mentioned that, of course, under the present conditions, people need living wages in order to buy more expensive food. But the point obviously is that, as Peter Rossett would say, we have a cheap food regime. And in other words, we're not paying for the full cost of the food. But that's because of the subsidies. And so I'm thinking, I'm doing some dreaming like Annette would like us to do. And trying to think beyond, and that's what I meant about food sovereignty being about civic self-determination. In other words, transforming the way in which society and policy are actually organized and recentering on agriculture as the foundation of social life and the foundation of our very ability to continue to live sustainably on planet Earth. So I mean, I think that's an important part of it, and you know, in the early post-war period, during what I would call the development project period in the third world, countries like Mexico, for example, Brazil, built development alliances around urban populations, and the governments used subsidies to support their urban populations, transport, health, education, all of those kinds of things, and they were doing it not just out of the goodness of their heart, but they were doing it in order to contain and manage their urban populations and to develop patronage systems, of course. So why can't that kind of approach be shifted into the agrarian sector to support small-scale farming? And I think that's one way to think about it. It has been done before, and it could be done again, and it could very likely become an important thing to do as we see the industrial agricultural system begin to collapse, which is my dream. But I think it's already happening. It's in crisis, and it's only being sustained through the continuation of subsidies and all kinds of political machinations. Now, in Europe, and I don't know too much about it, but the Common Agricultural Policy have some facility for supporting multifunctionality, and they talk about environmental services or ecosystem services, which is not a concept I particularly like, because it's about monetizing nature, essentially. But nevertheless, farmers are being paid in order to preserve environments, to conserve environments, to provide jobs, etc. And it's a very small percentage of the CAP budget, but nevertheless, the Europeans do understand that this is an important issue. The Americans will never understand it. Well, they may, if food sovereignty becomes sufficiently powerful. But so do you see what I'm trying to get at? I think it's about dreaming. It's about revisioning how to organise society, and I think it has to be grounded in the agrarian sector, in the agri-food system. So that's one part of it. The other part of it is that, and Hannah did mention this in her talk, that a lot of the agriculture in Europe, the local food production that happens under the radar through the local food markets, etc., is in part subsidised by off-farm labour, and that's partly because small farms, family farms across the world are not sufficiently supported. They're not valued, and that was my final point, of course, that to the woman up the back who asked the question, that modernity devalues the rural, devalues agriculture. So it's really important to seize hold of this concept, say, of agrarian citizenship that Hannah uses, that I think sort of captures the idea that whereas citizenship under modernity is usually associated with urbanity, we need to rethink what citizenship really means in order to survive the future. Many indigenous cultures, of course, use collective and commons in order to maintain their communities. So it's not just individual farms and farm households. People work together. So those are ideas that can be adopted to address this kind of problem. Obviously, it means getting beyond a monetized, commercial-based understanding of agriculture and food. On the scaling up, the first thing I could think of was that why would you scale up agroecology when agroecology is profoundly connected to place? Of course, all places are different, so agroecological methods are going to be very different. And I was thinking, say, of Eric Holtermanus's work, where farmer-to-farmer networks became ways of scaling out horizontally, which Hannah actually mentioned herself. It seems to me that that's how we need to think about this, not so much getting bigger, but enlarging the sphere, building community and building networks to strengthen and thereby put pressure on governments to support the very agroecological small farming, diverse farming that is necessary to meet the future. I've been to Detroit. I'm actually part of a food dignity group in Ithaca, New York, and it's about an urban food system that's built around justice, particularly race and class issues. And what struck me about the inner city, people that I met, like Malik Yelini, who I believe will be here tomorrow if he's not here now. Is Malik here? No. is that Grace Lee Boggs, who's one of the oldest radicals left in the United States, we met her for dinner one night, and she was very proudly talking about the way in which the inhabitants of inner city Detroit were having to deal with the fact that they'd been abandoned as what's your name again? Kami mentioned. Chamber of Commerce, white flight, middle class flight, etc. And that in fact what was happening was that the people who are left are beginning to reclaim abandoned lots in the urban centre, and particularly engage youth in taking responsibility and getting involved in local farming, so that they would maintain a sense of connection and not leave, that they'd stay and continue this practice as they moved into adulthood. And she used this phrase, bringing the countryside to the city, which I thought was a wonderful way of sort of capturing the conflation or the collapsing of the urban-rural difference, and recognising that in fact urban populations can very much feed themselves if they have access to the land and the support of local communities, etc. And so all of these things I think are very heartening, and I tend to feel that the hope lies in the mushrooming of these local movements all around the world that we don't know about because they operate under the radar, but nevertheless, in a sense, it seems to me they're anticipating when the shit's going to hit the fan, even if it hasn't started hitting it yet. They're a little bit like the transition town movements, who recognise that in 20 or 30 years' time, local communities are not only going to have to need to materially take care of themselves, but they're going to have to need to have figured out how to work together. And as you know, those of you who work in local food movements, there are a lot of personalities involved, and it takes a lot of time, but it's worth the struggle.
So we want to open it up for comments and questions, reflections from the audience. I'm sure a lot of people here are here because they have been participating in some of these movements at the local level or sometimes at international or global level. So if you want to share your experience, please feel free to do so. And we'll take some comments or questions. Yeah?
I was child labor.
And if you can speak loud because
I'll stand up. I was child labor on a family peasant farm in southwestern Michigan during the Great Depression of the 1930s. And during that time, the cooperative movement was very successful in this country. There was a distributors cooperative in the small community, agricultural community where I grew up. And they dealt not just in cash transactions, but in barter as well. It was a non-profit co-op. And of course, the co-op movement is very active here in Ann Arbor. We have student residences and we have consumer co-ops here. But I wonder, and I'm putting this as a question to the panel, whether the co-op movement, formalized nonprofit co-ops, are effective in other parts of the world, and whether promotion of them would be an important part of the grassroots movement because they are organized from the bottom up. I have another question, though, that relates to food sovereignty being dependent upon water sovereignty. And I don't see any entries here in the agenda for dealing with that issue. But that is one that seems to me comes as a battle for people who are trying to do things from the bottom up, because so often water is controlled by large institutions, and particularly the privatization now of water in parts of Latin America is becoming a serious problem. And certainly water availability in a time when climate is changing is going to be a very important issue for food sovereignty.
So, okay,
Somebody
do you want
wants
us to
to-
respond, or do you want to do several questions?
Yeah, well, why don't we take a few questions and, let's take a few questions and then have some feedback from the panel. And also if you have some comments or if you want to also respond to the question. Anybody? Yeah.
So I've just two comments. One was regarding, I feel like one thing that tends to get lost, especially in complex issues like sustainability or sovereignty, is people put so much attention on trying to define what it is. And in terms of ensuring that there's mobilization, that we do something with it, I'd like to suggest looking at it from a perspective of how does attention happen. So when we talk about sovereignty, whether it's food sovereignty or anything else, for me, one thing that I came to, and I'm just offering this is all up to you to bring your own story and perspective. But for me, I see that sovereignty tends to happen when we're able to make dignified choices that fulfill our individual needs as well as the broader communities. And that gets us away from trying to say this or that, but being able to come from a stance of action. And then stepping back further into the field of kind of back in the day with sustainability, people would talk about sort of the bottom line, for example, or whatever else, where you're trying to fulfill social, economic, and environmental needs in a way that integrates all of them. And I feel that those same principles will tie into everything that we're looking for in looking at some of the emerging threads that come up for sovereignty as well. So when it comes to today, I just want to encourage everyone that's whatever drew you to this event, those reasons, whether it's pain or something that you aspire to, those will be very instrumental in informing what it is that you need to do, and from there, yeah, that's it.
Thank you. Any other question? Peter?
Yeah, on the question of scaling up agroecology or bringing agroecology to a territorial scale, I think the problem is that the concepts have both a formal technical definition and the way that we use them in practice. So I think that Via Campesina sees increasingly bringing agroecology to a territorial scale as essential to building food sovereignty, but that doesn't mean in a very big farm. It means lots of small families over an increasingly territorial level. And I think that's also the way we see it in the EcoSur group. So then we're increasingly seeing that it's the social processes and social organization and allies and all kinds of things like that that are sometimes even more key than the actual agroecological technology. Instead of it being a few families who farm agroecologically on a small area, that it be a lot of families who farm agroecologically over a whole territorial level.
So that's what Hannah was calling scaling out, no?
Technically,
Did
that's
you mention
scaling
that?
out, right? But
Yeah.
we use the words loosely.
Yeah.
The formal definition of scaling up means to bring it into institutional policy. But the informal way it gets used all the time is it's indistinguishable. Scaling out means a bigger area.
Okay, Amy?
That actually goes to the question.
Oh, okay. John?
I'd like to comment on what was brought up by both Phil and Hannah associated with the subsidy structure. And just recently, can people hear me okay?
Yes.
No.
No, go ahead. Just talk loud.
Okay, I'd like to comment on what both Hannah and Phil were talking about when they talked about the subsidy structure in agriculture. Just recently, Aaron Iverson, who happens to be sitting right over here, but I'll talk for him anyway. Just recently, he defended his PhD thesis where he did a very careful analysis of ecological complexity and how it relates to the ecosystem service, excuse me, Phil, but the ecosystem service of pest control in the coffee agricultural ecosystem. And what he showed was there's effect, but it's not all that significant, it's not all that impressive. But then he added to that his field work, he added to that an economic analysis. And on the one hand, he analyzed the economics of sort of a positive change in economic activities, whereby farmers engaging in more ecologically complex activities would receive some sort of a premium. So this could be something like a premium for organic agriculture, or a premium for shade coffee, or bird friendly, or biodiversity friendly, or some such thing. And then he added to that the opposite end of the spectrum, where farmers who currently are receiving hidden subsidies for example, artificial fertilizers or pesticides and things like that, would be constrained from receiving those subsidies, which is to say those subsidies would no longer exist. And when you add that analysis to his fieldwork, to the data on ecological complexities and ecosystem services, what's extremely dramatic, the bump that you get, the bump that the farmers would get from doing ecologically complex agroecological farming. So it's a question of both of those things, and the way I like to think about it is the way people in the divest movement are talking right now, to divest in the bad stuff that's happening and invest in the good stuff that's happening. When you do both of those things at the same time, this invest-divest strategy actually, according to Aaron's data, yields a tremendous bump for the ecological complexity.
Okay, maybe one more for this round, or maybe two more, okay? See?
I am really excited to hear also these thoughts about scaling up. Sorry, I usually have to stand up, and still sometimes people don't see me. I'm a co-editor on a participatory natural resource management book where we tried to bring together stories of scaling out, and we had the opportunity to present it at a Millennium Ecosystem Services meeting where we had in Egypt, at Alexandria, we had the opportunity to sit with people bridging worldviews, indigenous worldviews and scientific so-called worldviews. And I'll never forget, because we were all worried about how do we scale out? How do we reach more people? And this a very indigenous person said, well, what about looking at liberation theology? We're looking at the literacy movements in Nicaragua, that how people have themselves out of these movements have come teaching and education that then scales this out. You don't have to worry so much about orchestrating this. This will come up from underneath. And then he sat down, and I've never forgotten that. So I'd like to hear if there's any of those kind of things that we're not necessarily acknowledging.
Okay, Eddie?
Well, we're stuck on scaling up or out or in or down, but I want to sort of add to the discussion from the perspective of political economy. Because if you look at the political economy of the food system and where farming is in the food system, the first thing you see is that the farmer only gets about 10 cents on the food dollar. Now this is down from something like 40 cents on the food dollar at the turn of the last century. And so what happened is a process which political economists call appropriation and substitution. And that means that on the upstream side of farming, capital has colonized the value chain. So with all of the inputs, the fertilizers and the pesticides and mechanization and all that. So they keep incurring into what the farmer used to control. When the farmer grew their own manure, when the farmer had animal traction for power on the farm and those things. So now those have become commodities. And so the value of the food value chain, right, is now accruing to capital rather than to the farmer. And on the downstream side, which is called substitution, the relationship between the raw product that the farmer produces and what the consumer actually eats has also been colonized primarily by the processors and the especially the big retailers, so the big food monopolies. And that's why the farmer gets so little. So we can do all the scaling out we want, but unless we scale out into the appropriation side and the substitution side of the food value chain, then most farmers are going to have the same comment that I forget someone said, I think it was your presentation, Hannah, no one told me I couldn't make a living doing this. So I think that's a big part of scaling, right? So we scale into the value chain. And that will happen only after great resistance on the part of capital. You know, they've spent a long time colonizing those areas. And then I also just want to make a quick comment about the issue of subsidies. I think there's a misconception that subsidies sort of allow the industrial agriculture to produce all this cheap food, to overproduce all this cheap food, which brings the price down. It's the other way around. It is the system which overproduces this cheap food, and then the subsidies come in. And subsidies are actually very important for farmers. And I agree completely. It's what kind of subsidies and to what type of farming is what we have to look at. But farming has been subsidized in some way throughout its history, for the simple reason that for farming you have to invest all this effort and then sit around and wait. And you know, that means that somebody has to subsidize that period in the labor process. So society has found different ways to do this. So I think we have to be careful about how we talk about subsidies as the cause of the problem, when in fact subsidies help solve a particular problem in the political economy of agriculture. And the question asked is, for whom are they solving the problem, and what kind of agriculture?
Okay, so let's hear from our panelists. If anybody has a reaction or some reflections about the and answers to the questions. There was a question about water. There was yeah. So anybody?
Right.
Short ones. Okay, well, I'll start with the cooperatives question, because I think, again, that gets us to the whole issue of the value of alternative economies and how do those alternative economies work? What are some of the key problems with them, and also what are the benefits of building alternative economies? The issue with cooperatives, and I'm from the prairies in Western Canada, and our history is full of these incredibly strong cooperatives, but then they got too big. And you know, the issue of scale in cooperatives is absolutely key. At least our history tells us that. So I think cooperatives offer a lot of opportunities, and in fact a lot of alternative economies are working with cooperatives. But I think the cautionary note is always to, if you want to ensure democratic practices, which are the building blocks of real cooperatives, then you have to do something about scale. You have to be very careful about that. But I wanted to get back to Cammie's big question, which was, how do you affect social change? That was your question, right? So how do you engage in revolution? I actually think, again, I'll refer to a very, very good, interesting lesson, I think, that many of us learned from, I think, which was how the processes that the Via Campesina engaged in to create the space for women's participation and representation. And I give that example because you asked also the question of, well, how do you deal with the tensions and the conflicts? And I think I think the Via Campesina was, I mean, as far as I know, it is the only transnational movement to actually have restructured itself so that women can participate. And as a result of that, the issues that the Via Campesina talks about have changed. Food sovereignty has changed. So I think, you know, again, it's creating that space for the debates to take place, for the tensions to arise, and of course finding ways to mediate, to ensure that the conflicts don't mean that everybody leaves the room. So and in that, I think academics have a really important role. I think as facilitators, we are in a privileged position to be able to actually help create the space. Because we have access to more resources than a lot of community-based organizations or movements, and so we can use those resources to actually create that physical space, which hopefully turns into a political space where the debates you allow for the debate to take place. And I think Raj Patel was so right when he said, and I'm paraphrasing him here, but he said that what food sovereignty is about is it is about allowing the debates to take place. And I think we can facilitate that. I think we, in fact, have an important responsibility to do so.
I'll just speak quickly to the cooperative one because it's an issue that I'm very interested in and have followed over the years. In the work that I did in Brazil, I had the opportunity to interview many people who had left cooperatives within the MST, and similar dynamics happening amongst the kind of new farming groups that are forming in British Columbia, which are often trying to do so cooperatively, and finding it extremely challenging. And I've been really interested in why is it so difficult to form these new cooperatives. And one of the conclusions that I've come to is as a society, we lack cooperative literacy. That people will often say, well, I join a cooperative and there's just all these people telling me what to do all the time. I want to have autonomy. I want to have independence. And I think that's because we've lost the ability to understand what it means to cooperate. So that's something that's a systemic problem. It's not a problem of cooperatives per se. And I think that's something that we can work on in our schools. And this speaks to the question of how do you do justice from below. Also, how do you define justice and with whom? And that takes a kind of cooperative understanding of what it means to cooperate. The other thing that I really found was this conflation of a cooperative as a lifestyle. So there's a lot of kind of intentional community building where every single decision has to be discussed cooperatively, and that can be very tiresome and time-consuming, and people tend to filter out. Versus understanding cooperatives, the cooperatives I've seen that have worked really well have a very clear mandate. We will be marketing cooperatively, or we will be producing this crop cooperatively, and not trying to have to live communally, which is a different objective. Not that that's not a good objective also, but just making sure that people have really clear understandings of what is on the table to cooperate about and what is left aside for kind of independent decision making, and striking that balance. I think the cooperatives that I've seen that have worked really well have managed to strike that balance. And it's quite hopeful what they're able to accomplish.
Well, this is a hard act to follow because Annette pointed out that once women's voices were included, things changed, and so I don't want to revert back by coming up and speaking after these two wonderful women. But I'd say a couple of things. One is our experience with the Food Dignity Project in Ithaca has been a real eye-opener, and I think the idea of the lack of cooperative literacy is very pertinent. We've had a very difficult time, those of us who are at Cornell, attempting to develop partnerships with people in the community, and it's partly because Cornell is a suspicious institution for the people in the community because it's a very wealthy institution, and it has never been very good at sharing its wealth with the community. And one of the points about our Food Dignity Project is that we're trying to actually model a different way in which Cornell can actually reach out and partner with the community. So that takes a lot of time, and I think it has to do with obviously the class issue, but also the race issue, and it has also to do with the incredible specialization in our societies compared, say, to many cultures in the South where you don't have as much specialization, at least in the communities that we're talking about. So that's been a real eye-opener, and it's taking a lot of time, and we have to develop a lot of patience. So that's one thing. The other thing is, and the role of academics, which I mentioned very briefly in my talk. And the way I see it, and it's not the only way, obviously, but the way I see it from my vantage point working with social movements in Rome, where you have fisher folk and you have indigenous peoples and you have agricultural workers and you have small farmers coalitions. And each of those movements have their own particular constituencies. And so the representatives who come to Rome, who are very sensitive to the fact that they need to represent their communities adequately and then go back and represent the debates appropriately to their communities, they're very focused on how they enact that representation and don't have the time or the resources, as I said, to look at the bigger picture, and that is, you know, what's happening in terms of the world food system or the world food regime, whatever you want to call it. And that's where I see, you know, that's where I can provide. You know, I don't do field work, but I can do that kind of work. And I think that that's a place where academics who want to work on these larger issues and actually, you know, track what's going on with the World Bank, because those institutions are always one step ahead of the movements, because they know what they want and they know how they're going to do an end run around, you know, whatever kind of progress has been made, say, in the FAO. And so the New Alliance is a very good example. They claim that they're using the 10-year guidelines that came out of the CFS, that came out of the civil society pressure, and yet they're perverting them and they're turning them into titling processes, which of course are built around investment and efficiency and economics, and they're totally obliterating the possibility of understanding that tenure guidelines, customary tenure, is based on a much broader understanding of value, not monetary value, but ecological value and cultural value and spiritual value and so forth. So I think that there's a role for academics in providing that kind of service to bring to the debates the possibility of understanding, you know, what is going on, say, in the development community and how the development community is actually, you know, keeping one step ahead and what they're up to and how that's going to affect the possibilities for food sovereignty strengthening. So those are the two comments I would make. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it looks like we're getting toward the end of the discussion today. But before we finish and go and eat the wonderful food that we have for you tonight, I want to invite Susan and Dan to come and say something about the food. Susan is the owner of a local business called the Juicy Kitchen. And Dan is a well-known chef here in Ann Arbor, and they try to get as much local as possible and organic, etc. So it will be great if you can tell us just a little something about what we're going to be eating.
Susan and I have been working together about 2.5 years. I helped open Juicy Kitchen. And we found that over time, and I think we knew this at the beginning, that we shared a kind of a sourcing value, the same, where we do want to support the local farmers. Sustainable, I'm not really sure the true definition of that word. Maybe responsible is more environmentally responsible. But if we have to, we'll go outside the box to support those same people from around the region and around the country too. So for the appetizers, we're using Tantre Farm, Black Oak Farm, the trout, and those are all pretty local. The trout comes from farms around the Georgian Bay, and that we've used in the potatoes from Tantre Farms. And we're really thrilled to be here and be serving you these next 3 meals. Thanks.
Yes, I hope everybody comes for the food, and also breakfast tomorrow. We're serving for lunch. We're getting our we have a lot of salads, and we're getting our salads right now from a CSA from a place called Landloom, and also Green Things. So it's all really super fresh, really beautiful lettuces, salmon from Canada, but it's a sustainable salmon. We're getting our rolls from Avalon Organic Bread in Detroit. We're making a nice soup with all organic produce from Tantre Farms. So we hope to see you all tomorrow as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan and Dan. Okay, well, with that, why don't you join me in thanking the panelists and the commentators for tonight? And I hope to see you all tomorrow as well. Please hang on and continue the discussion.